lesson for today, part 4, standard form. So this is a linear equation written in standard form. Ax plus by equals c. Now here's the difference. In the other problems, you could have decimals and fractions. You are not allowed to have decimal and fractions in standard form. A, b, and c are either whole or integers, which means you can have negatives and positive numbers, but you cannot have fractions or decimals for A, B, or C. Now you can plug in fractions and decimals, but A, B, and C need to be whole numbers or negatives. So something like this would be totally acceptable. Now, if you had to graph it, you have two options. Let's talk about option number 1, changing it to slope-intercept. Okay, now, if you're going to graph this by changing it to slope-intercept, here's what you have to do. You have to make this look like this, which means you're solving for y. You want the y by itself. So let me write this down. If you're going to solve this in terms of y, you're going to have to get rid of this 12 and the 4x. We're going to start with the 4x. The inverse of 4x, now this number is a positive. To get rid of it, we're going to do negative 4x. And whatever you do to one side, you do to the other, like that. So the 4x's cancel out, but these are not like terms. So you just leave it as negative 4x minus 24. You just write them together on the same side. I like to put the x at the beginning, but you can put the x at the end. So if you wanted to write minus 4x, that's also fine. But I want it to look like this, remember? So next, that 12 has to go. So I'm going to divide by negative 12 because this 12 is multiplying. I want to leave the y alone, so I don't want to add 12y. If I add 12y, it will cancel it out. So I'm going to just divide by 12. Just divide by 12. Now when you divide, you have to divide everything by the same number. So what that looks like is this. Y, because that cancels out, equals positive 1/3, the x doesn't go away, plus 2. Negative 24 divided by negative 12 is a plus 2. So 1, 2, up 1 over 3, up 1 over 3, there's my line. There's my line. And that's it. So that's one way to solve it by graphing, is by changing this, by moving the 4x and the 12 to look like this. Now, option number 2. Find the x and the y intercepts. So if you have this formula, another way to graph it is to find the coordinates where this will touch the y-axis and the x-axis. If we can find those numbers, you can also graph it, which is what we're going to do. So how do you find that? You're going to plug in 0. But you're going to plug in 0 twice. So for the first one, if I plug in a 0 here, let me actually separate this. We're going to do it twice. If you plug in a 0 for x, you're going to solve for the y. And you'll get a y-intercept. Now, if you plug in a 0 for the y, you're going to solve for the x-intercept. So when you plug in 0 into one of them, you're going to be able to solve the other one. Let's start with this one. 4 times 0 is 0, which means that's gone. You're just solving for this now. You divide both sides by negative 12. Y equals a positive 2. Okay, here, 12 times 0 is 0, so you're left with this. You're going to divide by 4. So your two intercepts are at 2 and at negative 6. So what does that mean? Well, let's go to the graph. If your first one is at 2, that means right here at the coordinate 0, 2 is your y-intercept. Remember, y is 2. So that is your y-intercept. What about your x-intercept? Negative 6. Oh, well, what do you know? negative 6, 0 is your other intercept. So if you have those 2 points, you just draw a line connecting those 2 points and you get the same graph. So when you do this, you have to remember these are coordinates. X is 0, y is 2. X is negative 6, y is 0. You take those points, you graph those 2 points, and you get the same line. So those are the 2 options you have for graphing. Now sometimes they don't need you to graph it, sometimes they just ask you, find the intercepts. And you're going to do the same thing, what I just showed you. You're going to plug in 0 for one and solve for the other. And you'll find the intercepts that way. Okay, and the great thing about it is if you plug in 0, what basically happens is you just get a problem where you're solving for one of them at a time. You're solving for y by itself and you're solving for x by itself. You do that and you'll get your answers. So in this case, when I divide both sides by 12 because of inverse operations, right, you're going to get negative 12. If you divide this by 8, you're going to get positive, let's see, 144. You're going to get 18, positive 18. And then if you wrote these as coordinates, x is 0, y is negative 12. That is your y-intercept. Here, when you plug in 18, you get 0 for y, and those are your 2 intercepts. Now you can graph it. You can take those 2 points and graph it. Now, if, let's say the 0 is replacing one of the numbers. So in this case, if you have a 0 for b, then that's gone. You have a very simple problem like this. Or if a is 0, remember that was the first number was a, if that's a 0, you're left with this. And when you solve these, there is only one intercept. So in this case, when you solve for this one, x equals 3, if you were to graph this, guys, the only intercept is at positive 3, at 3, 0. And if there's only one intercept, guys, your line looks like this. Because there's only one point. Because this doesn't exist. There is no y. Now here there is no x. So when you solve this, you're going to get positive 5. So your coordinate, when you graph this, will be at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Add 0, 5. That's your y-intercept. And your line would look like this. So if you ever get linear equations like this, where there is no x or if there's no y, there's only one variable, you're going to get either a vertical line or a horizontal line. Last thing, word problem. The word problem for these is generally going to be something like this. You're going to get 2 different items. In this case, you're going to buy soda and water, right? So these are the 2 items. Now, you have a total, and when you get your total, that is your C. So in this case, C is 80. Well, what about A and B? A and B is the cost of them separately. So what does it cost for water? What does it cost for a soda? So when you set it up in a word problem, it would look like this, where A would be 150 and B would be 2. And then you write your equation. 150x plus 2y equals 80. And that would be the way you set up the equation. Now, if you notice, this is a decimal, and it's only because this is a word problem. In a word problem, you're using it to solve for the word problem. Right now, I'm just showing you how to write the problem down. Once you write the problem down, you can then try to graph it by finding the intercepts. But normally, you wouldn't have a decimal. This is an exception. But that's how you would write it in standard form. And guys, That's standard form.